Welcome back, Gadgeteers. I know it's been a while since I put out a video. It's been pretty busy around the house. As you can see, I'm actually sitting outside right now. The main reason is that my studio is completely torn apart right now because my youngest son's actually moving back in. He's working on his degree, so he's going to live with me for a while, and my middle son. And as a result, I had to move my computer and equipment back into my regular room. So I've been working on that, and my son's feeling a lot better, the one that was sick. There was a period of time there for a while that he was having a problem holding down food, and it lasted about 8 to 10 days. And we had him to emergency, we had him to doctors, and that was really no fun. But as it is right now, he's doing really well, so things have settled down, thankfully. And what we're going to talk about now is the 5 reasons I think you should seriously consider making Linux your next operating system. Now, I originally called this something like the reason why Linux was going to be the top operating system, but looking at the statistics, one of the things I looked at was how the adoption of Linux is going. Now, according to the operating systems by percentage, Linux has 0.68% of the market, and that line has been relatively steady for the last 5 years, so I don't see it as taking over the market per se. Personally, I wish it would, but I don't really think it's going to. I think that these 5 reasons I'm going to talk about are something worth looking into when it's time for you to consider your next operating system. So without further ado, number 1, it's easier to install than ever before. I've been doing some experimentation with installation on different hardware. Case in point, I bought the Lenovo Yoga 920, which is a very new laptop. Many of you may say, yeah, it's basically the same thing as the 910. It really is not. It's very different as far as hardware goes. I was a little surprised as to the updates and changes. And as a result, I was thinking Fedora 27 especially would not install at all. And to my pleasure and happiness, it actually installed perfectly fine. So that's one example. If you look at other people that have been installing Linux on different computers and different systems, it's really become a very simple matter, and I would argue that it's far easier than it is to install macOS, and far easier especially than installing Windows. So I know that most computers come installed with Windows, so most people don't have to worry about that fact. But in reality, if you did have to install it, based on my experience across the board, I'm going to say that Linux is the easiest to install. And the installation programs that are used on the different systems like Ubuntu and Fedora have gotten very, very good, even Debian. And as far as hardware goes, I feel like the hardware support is definitely there. Now, many of you may argue with me, and that's another point that I'm going to talk about in a minute, but you can only go by your experience and what you've heard other people say. And I think you should give it a try. If you're curious or interested in installing Linux on your system, consider doing a dual boot. One of my regular viewers, Stacy, suggested using an external hard drive. He said, you know, you could just use an external hard drive, install an operating system that you are interested in, whichever flavor of Linux, and see how it works on your actual physical hardware. That way you can do updates, install drivers, and do everything that you would normally do in Windows. So give it a try. Tell me what you think. All right, number 2. And this one I'm sure will be controversial. Linux supports more hardware than ever before. And to some extent, I'm going to argue that it actually supports the most hardware out of all the operating systems. It's easy to say it supports more hardware than macOS. That's pretty obvious. The fact is, you can install any flavor of Linux to a certain point on any Mac system, and you can install it on any Windows-based system. So it's safe to say that the hardware platform, if you think of the broad width of hardware that's available, Linux really does dominate that. Now, there is a caveat, of course. Getting an operating system working on a hardware platform doesn't mean every single piece of hardware works perfectly. This is the case with any operating system, but in terms of hardware support, that is still an area where Linux is lacking. I still get many reports from my users and my viewers saying, hey, you know what? I cannot get the NVIDIA driver to install. What ideas do you have? What tips do you have? Now, in my case, I'm using the Dell 5675 with the Ryzen 1700, and I've got a RX 580 card in there, and I didn't have any issues with drivers at all. It actually was fairly automatic. I think at one point I had to install AMD GPU with a DNF install, but I'm pretty sure on the latest and greatest versions of Linux, you should have immediate hardware support to some level of graphics cards, networking, certainly chipsets and processors. So personally, if you look out there, I think you'll see that Linux is really good at supporting hardware. Not necessarily always the newest hardware, but the fact is they're getting better and better and better. And I think part of that is owed to the fact that hardware is really an evolutionary process now. It's not revolutionary where there's something incredible and brand new. The architectures for the most part remain the same, but what changes over time is the speed and bandwidth, more memory, more compute cycles, and so on and so forth. So personally, I think with this evolutionary design we're seeing right now, it's easy for Linux to support that. If we talk about quantum computing in the future and those types of changes, well, things would be a little different. Linux would have to play a little bit of catch up, and I'm sure Windows would as well, and macOS too. All right, number 3. Game support is increasing on a regular basis. Now, I'm going to throw up a couple of images here, one of a graph regarding Steam games that are available in Linux, and you can see that the titles just continue to increase and increase and increase. Now, Vulkan support, I don't see very many games yet with Vulkan support, but I do believe that Vulkan is going to be the ultimate successor to OpenGL, and I'm actually hoping also it will be to DirectX. If you think about it, if we had an open standard for our game API, for that hardware API, we definitely would be in a position where development would increase much faster and more titles would support that, which would make porting to Linux much easier. So you may not see all the AAA titles that you want to see running on Linux, but the fact is the list of plays on Linux games is quite long. I was really surprised. I went in and checked it out. There are a ton of games that will play on Linux. If you're saying the title I want isn't working on Linux, that's completely different than saying there aren't any games for Linux. I just see that way too often, and that's the poorest argument I've ever seen. The other thing that tends to annoy me is when somebody says you have to play on Windows, there's no other way. This is my opinion, okay? Take it for what you will. I'm not the uber gamer, so I don't know everything about the gaming world, but my personal opinion is if you've gotten above 50 to 60 frames per second, that is more than sufficient. And I don't for a minute believe that your eye can see the difference between 60 frames per second and 120 frames per second. I'm not talking about game lag or processor overload or video card overload where you get lag or hesitation or any of that stuff. If you've got a 120 hertz monitor and you've got 60 frames a second, and even if you've got a 60 hertz monitor, in all reality, I highly doubt you can really see the lag. But with the frame rate, I don't believe for a minute that you really can tell that much of a difference. But That's just my opinion. I know it's going to be controversial. I'll leave it out there for you guys. I don't really play all that many video games, so if you agree, disagree, drop the comments down below. Food for thought, right? Linux, if you got more than 60 frames a second and you're running it on a 120 hertz monitor, I don't think you're going to see a whole lot of difference in comparison to a Windows install of that same game, provided the hardware is matching. One of the problems, of course, is some games Linux doesn't do quite as well as Windows, and that is a fact. We do know that. Okay, have I talked about everything I wanted to talk about with game support? I believe so. I just want to emphasize again, just because the game you play isn't available on Linux doesn't mean there aren't a lot of games available to play on Linux. I'm playing Witcher 2 on Linux, and it works great. Is it as good as Windows? No, actually, there's a few less frames, but I'm going to do a video on that and experiment with Witcher 2 on both of them, Linux and Windows, and we're going to see what kind of frame rate we get and anything I can do to enhance the capability. We'll use the same exact hardware platform. Okay, number 4. And again, I think this one's going to be very controversial. Upgrading is easier and more reliable than either Windows or Mac. If you've been watching, the latest Spring Creators Update is actually being postponed because of massive amounts of blue screens that Windows was causing with the Creators Update in beta testing. So they were releasing it to certain groups, and they were finding that there was a lot of blue screening going on, so the update was halted. macOS 10.13.4, if you're keeping up on that, it's actually causing an installation failure, and a fair percentage, I can't be sure how many yet because the reports are still early, are having problems installing 10.13.4. So the whole thing is, and I hope I got that version number correctly, the whole thing is they're telling you, well, Apple isn't telling you, but most professionals are saying you should wait for that update. My experience with Windows updates and macOS updates is to be very patient. I like to wait and see what happens instead of just installing the updates the day they come out or even the week they come out. I like to give it a little bit of leeway so I can see what happens. But there are just as many problems with Windows updates as there are with Linux or Mac OS. And I'm going to emphasize that. Again, this is personal experience. I'm going to say that there's actually far less problems with updates in Linux than there are with Windows or Mac. This again is personal experience and what I read on the internet. I very rarely hear anybody say Ubuntu was broken when I did updates or Linux was broken when I did updates, and therefore it's really not an issue when I do updates. There are many updates. Just yesterday I did a Linux update on my desktop system. It had 907 megabytes of updates, which is essentially the entire operating system. How confident did I feel that I could do these updates? Well, while I was doing the updates, I was actually using Handbrake to rip one of my DVDs to my server so that I could use it in the house on all the different systems I have in my house. While I was working on editing a video, I was actually running updates. No crashes, no problems, okay? Everything worked perfectly fine. I did the reboot, 2 or 3 hours later because I was really busy. I didn't have to do the reboot. I could actually choose when I wanted to do the reboot, which could have been never for all I care, right? I could have left the thing running for 5 more years. And this is another controversy. You can't do that because your packages don't get updated. That is true for only a tiny amount of packages, including the kernel, which of course you have to do a reboot, some of the GUI, and maybe some other packages that are underlying services like Xorg or Wayland or whatever you're using. But for the most part, no, not a problem. You actually don't have to shut your system all the way down. You could, if you wanted to in Linux, do an init3, shut down the GUI, doing init 5, bring the system back up in the graphical interface, except the kernel. The kernel is the only thing that you really would have to reboot the system to get it updated. Maybe a few other things. But for the most part, services are rehopped in Linux individually. They're very granular. That's what I love about Linux, right? If you get a network stack update, that network stack will be rehopped. And in many cases, about 100%, okay, maybe not that many, 95% of the time, there will be no problems, okay? I used to run a firewall that had hundreds of thousands of people connected through that firewall to our main support systems that we were running and our authentication servers. I would do updates on that system and the firewall would get rehopped and I wouldn't lose one connection, okay? I never had problems doing updates. Now that's a server, so it's a little different, okay? You may point out some of the videos where I crash Linux. That's because I'm asking for it. I'm doing things that I'm experimenting with. I want to find out what the limitations are. I don't want to just live in the safe space bubble. You never know when you might have to try something and see what happens. Case in point, I took a driver and uninstalled it, and I was hoping to get better mouse support, but I didn't read the documentation thoroughly enough, and guess what? I crashed my install of Linux. That was my fault. I did that, okay? I was experimenting. I was ripping out chunks of the Linux OS. What more could I expect? So don't look at those videos that I do where I blow up Linux, but I do it because I'm experimenting. All right, my last reason why you should seriously consider Linux as your next operating system, aside from all the things we've went over, we've talked about installation being easy, support for hardware, game support on the increase, upgrading being very simple and straightforward and in your control, which is really nice. This last one, most people don't even care about anymore, which blows my mind considering all the things that are happening. And the last one is security and privacy are important to Linux developers and distributions. Not all of the distributions, mind you. There are some like DeepinOS from China that I probably would not recommend as my core operating system, but most of the fully open source distributions honestly have your best interest at heart. That's rare. Think about Windows 10. Here's the thing that bothers me with Windows 10. If you, for example, decide to go use Facebook and it's a free service and they scrape all your information and track you and use that information to sell it and make money, you are the product. That's a little bit within the bounds of fairness, provided the collection of that information is legal and ethical. With Windows 10, as many point out, you do have to pay for it. Now, there was the free upgrade process that went on for about a year or two, and you still, to some extent, I believe, can get free upgrades. I believe if you install Windows, you can still get that free license if you're saying you're going to use Windows with some of the tools that are used for people with disabilities. I could be wrong, but that used to be the case at least about a year ago. I don't know if it still is. But Windows, something you have to pay for, especially at the corporate level or a business license, still collects information about you. And to me, that's galling. I realize all these other companies are doing it too, and we may have lost that battle and may not be able to get away from having our information collected. And I know there will be at least one of you that are going to comment, you can't even get on the internet these days without having information collected. Why are you worrying about Windows 10 and Microsoft? I know, and I agree, and that's why I'm saying the battle might already be lost, but it's a battle of entrenchment. You don't just give up ground because everybody else does it. Do you think wars are won that way? I mean, think about it for a minute. And not just wars, just life in general, business practices, expansion of businesses. They don't lose by saying, well, everybody does it anyway. Let's just give up and back out, right? We're not going to make it. So, no, I don't think it's fair to say everybody else does it. And I don't think when you pay for a product, you should have to argue with a company about whether or not your privacy and security is important. So you can get a free OS that does care about your privacy and your security, and essentially you're getting more out of it, out of that OS, as far as your personal information being protected and your security, than you are with an operating system that you pay for. It doesn't sound very fair to me. So what do you think? Those were my 5 reasons why I think Linux should be your next operating system. How do you feel about it? Are there reasons why you think Linux, aside from what I've talked about, should be your next operating system? If so, I'd love to hear them. Are there reasons why you think Linux should not be your next operating system? And I'm going to challenge you. If you're going to comment, don't just say because games with a Z on the end. Actually give me something, okay? Give me some titles that are not supported, that are popular, that you think really reflect the gamer's desire, okay, as an example. Give me examples that are concrete. Don't just tell me because Windows rules. We all know Windows has a lot of installations, but the fact is, I really want to know what your opinion is, but I want a little bit more beef. I love your comments, I really do. All right, that's all I've got for you. If you did enjoy this video, take a minute, like, and click the subscribe button. Now, they've been talking about the little icon bell, but I've heard that it really won't necessarily alert you every time there's a video. It's more for live streaming now. So I always recommend to folks to join me on Twitter, because every time I release a video, Twitter will give you an alert, and that way you will know. So if you're interested in doing that, just follow the link down below in the description. Simple to do, and you'll get notification of my videos. I also appreciate, and I've seen much of my videos being shared. That's really appreciated. And last, of course, drop me a comment, because I love hearing what you have to say. Thanks for hanging out with me this beautiful, what feels like an early summer afternoon. Apparently in Michigan it's going to be the last one for the next week. We're going to go back down to the 30s and 40s, probably get some more snow because it's Michigan and that's what we do around here. Anyway, have a good one. I'll see you next time on Fast Gadgets.
This video was made possible with support from viewers like you. If you find this video useful, consider becoming a patron for as little as $1 a month at patreon.com/FastGadgets.